Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another meditation and Dhamma talk here at Empty Cloud Monastery. So hello to Mary, Ron, Kauser Friend, and whoever else is currently watching. Good to have you with us. So as usual, we'll start with a period of about 30 minutes of meditation, and then after that, I'll give a talk. And I won't be giving much guidance. And hello, Kristen. So please go ahead and get in meditation posture. Sitting up nice and straight and allowing the body to relax. Make a particular effort to relax your face. So allowing your forehead to relax, your eyebrows, eyelids, your cheeks, lips, and jaw. So all these places where we tend to hold tension in the face, allowing each of these parts of the face to relax. So that the whole face feels very soft and loose. And take a few long, slow, deep breaths. With each breath, allowing the body and mind to release, releasing any activities we've been doing throughout the day, any thoughts we've been thinking, any tightness we're holding. Just let it all release. And bring full attention to the body, the experience of your body in this moment. Just noticing the condition of the body, whatever experience, whatever sensations coming and going in each moment. And also noticing the feeling of the mind. How the mind shifts and changes from moment to moment, expanding and contracting, rippling gently. And in the midst of body and mind, place your attention. Perhaps choosing a place in the body to center your attention. And once you've chosen a center point for attention, place it there and keep it there, not moving it anywhere else. So for the next period of time, this will be your practice. Allow the body to be still, allow the mind to be still. while cultivating a sharp, intense, clear awareness within that unmoving, unwavering field of attention. If there's agitation in the body or the mind, just observe it from that still point, like watching the waves rolling in and out by the seashore. We don't follow with the waves, we just watch as they roll in and out, sometimes slow and gentle, sometimes fast and rough. We just keep sitting peacefully, watching the ocean. In the same way, just keep body and mind firmly anchored in watchful stillness, aware of the waves moving through body and mind, but not affected by them, not moved by them, not disturbed by them, and not moving from our place. And if you notice you're swept up in some thought or emotion or sensation, the moment you notice, you're already back at your still point. And you realize you've never left that still point. You're just watching what it was to feel like one was caught up in something. So just watch what that feels like. Never straying from that place of stillness. Your vigilant watchtower in the middle of body and mind. If The body feels tense. It's just another wave of experience rolling past the watchful stillness. There's no need to try to force the body to relax. Knowing that the waves of sensation are constantly changing. Nothing stable to be found. We remain watchful and still in the midst of ever-changing flow of phenomena. Relax your posture. And hello to some more friends checking in. Hello, Miguel, Melinda, Elaine, John, and Liz. Welcome. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So today is the first of 3 talks I'll be giving on Vipassana this week. Last week I gave 3 talks on Samadhi, and this week I'll give 3 talks on Vipassana. So first off, just definition of terms. The word Vipassana has 2 parts. It has the prefix vi, which means distinct, and the word passana, which means seeing. So there's a few ways to understand this word. One is that it means seeing distinctly, as in seeing clearly. Another is it means a distinction in seeing, so a special or extraordinary kind of seeing. Or it means seeing distinctions, as in being able to clearly distinguish the difference between things. And I think all of these are valid ways of understanding the word. If I was to pick one, I would probably pick seeing clearly as my preferred meaning of it. Most commonly, the word Vipassana is simply translated as insight, which I think is a perfectly fine translation of the word. In fact, insight related to the word sight, just as Vipassana is related to the word passana, which means seeing. I think insight is a perfectly fine translation of Vipassana. And there's 3 ways that people sometimes talk about this word. One is saying that Vipassana is a state of mind. So when the mind is in a state where it is seeing clearly, so having this extraordinary, precise, wise understanding of experience. Another is that Vipassana is a quality of mind. So when there's some degree of insightful vision, some degree of insightful awareness, then that's the quality of Vipassana being present in the mind. Another use of this word is that it refers to activities, mental training exercises, which help to engender the first 2, which help to engender this extraordinary, distinct, insightful way of looking at our experiences. And once again, I think all of these ways of relating to the word are quite valid. So I don't lean strongly one way or the other. But most commonly when people, at least in Buddhism these days, most commonly when we use the word Vipassana, we're talking about meditation practices which are meant to help produce the mind of awakening, which are meant to help bring the mind to enlightenment, which are meant to help break through our deep-rooted delusions and defilements which prevent us from manifesting the mind of an awakened being. There's one somewhat popular misunderstanding which I'd like to clear up right off the bat. So there's a small number of people these days who claim that the word Vipassana is extraordinarily rare in the Pali Suttas, in the old scriptures. In fact, I recall one teacher who claimed it only appears twice in the entire Pali Canon. I don't know where this comes from because it's simply not true. So I've read the suttas in Pali many times, and the Buddha uses the word Vipassana, or a variant of the word Vipassana, literally hundreds of times. So this is not some exceptionally rare archaic term. It's actually quite common in the suttas. So just clearing that one out of the picture right away. And even if it was an uncommon word, it doesn't change the fact that the Buddha is talking about cultivating the mind of insight all the time, whether he uses this word or not. So when we're talking about Vipassana, once again, we're talking about the insight which clearly sees reality as it is, the insight which leads to the abandoning of one's defilements, which leads to a direct understanding of the nature of reality. That's what we're talking about when we use the word Vipassana. One way that the word is commonly used these days is in referring to particular techniques or methods of meditation. And this is okay, but it's important to keep in mind that any one particular Vipassana method is just one way of cultivating Vipassana. So there's no single right way and there's no single best way. And in fact, there's not even necessarily distinctly defined methods to be found. In the suttas, the Buddha tends to give rather broad frameworks for investigating our experience. And it's up to us to navigate through that framework and find ways of developing insight that work well for us. And over the intervening centuries, a number of teachers have developed specific, formalized, step-by-step procedures of doing Vipassana that worked well for them. And they shared those instructions with their students, and it's come to us. And that's all well and good, just keeping in mind that those systematic Vipassana procedures are just one way of doing things that work well for some people and not so well for other people. So these days, if you hear somebody use the word Vipassana, sometimes they mean specifically the Goenka Vipassana method, so the method taught by Goenka, or they mean the Mahasi Vipassana method, so the meditation style taught by Mahasi Sayadaw. Or there's a few others, but those are the two most commonly used ones. And again, those are ways of practicing, but they're not the only ways of doing Vipassana. And in the suttas, the Buddha, most commonly, he talks about practicing Vipassana in terms of seeing the three universal characteristics. So the three characteristics are that all things are anicca, which means impermanent, dukkha, which means unsatisfying, and anatta, which means impersonal. So seeing these three characteristics is the aspect of insight. It's cultivating the mind of insight, the practice of Vipassana. So in the meditation instructions I gave a few minutes ago, this was briefly incorporated. So the instructions I gave were actually one of practicing samadhi for several minutes, and then beginning to introduce the recognition of impermanence. So anicca sanya, the recognition that one's experiences, and therefore all phenomena, are impermanent. They're ephemeral. They're insubstantial. So this is one way of practicing Vipassana meditation. And it's one of the ways that I most commonly use. So there's a handful of methods which I commonly use. One of them is the recognition of impermanence. Another is silent illumination practice, or animitta samadhi, objectless samadhi. And another one that I sometimes use is the 6 elements, which is actually a way of observing not self, anatta. So these are three quite different methods. But the perception of impermanence is one way which is relatively easy to begin to practice, because the truth is everything is constantly changing all the time anyway. Our experience is changing every moment. Every single instant is different from the previous one. So it doesn't take a whole lot of attention or wisdom to start to recognize impermanence. The surprising thing is actually how quickly and how easily we stop recognizing impermanence. How quickly and easily we fall back on our old habit of relating to the world as being composed of persistent, stable objects that interact with each other, which is utter folly. It's utter delusion, but it's our normal way of relating to the world. So cultivating the recognition of impermanence then, on the one hand, it's quite easy because everything's changing all the time anyway, and it's just a matter of paying attention to that. And on the other hand, it's quite challenging because we're so used to doing the opposite. We're so used to imposing the perception of permanence onto the world, even though it's directly contrary to what's actually happening. It's kind of like if somebody is looking at a blue wall and they keep insisting, it's red, it's red, it's red, such a red wall, so much red. You're like, well, or you could pay attention and notice that it's actually blue. But the person keeps stubbornly insisting the wall is red. Well, this is basically what we've been doing since time immemorial. We've been stubbornly insisting that the world is composed of stable objects, despite the fact that if we just open our eyes and look at it, we'll clearly see that everything is impermanent, ephemeral, insubstantial, not quite real. Not quite solid. There's not really anything here. There's something happening, but you can't really say there's anything here, because the moment you pay attention, there's something else there. Something else that seems to be there. So this also edges into a related practice, which is the perception of emptiness, which is a much more advanced topic. And actually borders on the territory of animitta samadhi. So I might save that for talking about tomorrow. But for now, suffice to say that as one develops the recognition of impermanence, it can develop into the recognition of emptiness, which is a more advanced style of insight, a more advanced style of vipassana. Which is seeing phenomena not just as constantly changing, but rather as phenomena inherently not being definable as either existing or not existing. But again, that's a more advanced topic, so we'll talk about that perhaps tomorrow. So the recognition of impermanence, once again, is the first of the three, and it's often the easiest and most directly relatable of the three, since it's basically impossible to miss it when you start looking for it. The second is dukkha. So anyone who's been studying even the basics of Buddhist thought has probably encountered this word dukkha. So dukkha comes from the prefix dur, which means difficult or unpleasant, and the word ka, the root ka, which means to hold, to bear, to endure, to put up with. So dukkha literally means that which is difficult to put up with, that which is unpleasant to endure. So the word dukkha commonly gets translated as suffering, which is, it's okay. It's kind of, the word suffering has kind of become a technical term in Buddhist English. But it's a bit of a problematic translation because it misses the nuances of this word dukkha. So dukkha is anything that's even slightly uncomfortable, even slightly unpleasant or slightly unsatisfying is dukkha. So that when we start paying attention to our experience, we realize that there's some quantity of dukkha present in pretty much every single moment. Like right now, I'm experiencing a little bit of dukkha. But that's actually the way things always are. It's just that in this moment, if we choose to turn and look for dukkha, we see it's right there. It's always been there. And then this starts us down the track of investigating. Well, what is dukkha? What is the experience of dukkha? So coming to a full understanding of what dukkha feels like. And this is important because we spend most of our life trying to ignore the feeling of dukkha, either covering it up through pleasant experiences, such as binging on entertainment, or food, or conversation, or activities, or anything to try to distract ourselves from that persistent feeling of wrongness and discomfort in the mind. Or we try to just ignore it through spacing out, through daydreaming, through sleeping, through sleepwalking. So sleepwalking through life. That's another way that we try to avoid facing dukkha. Or some people, they recognize dukkha, but they wallow in it. Rather than trying to do anything about it, they just roll around in it and form a self-identity like, oh, I am the suffering one. I am the depressed one. I am so miserable and so much anguish. This is me. But that actually is a subtle form of finding pleasure, because it's the pleasure of self-entity. It's the pleasure of personality. It's the pleasure of having a stable sense of who we think we are. So that also is a way of not quite facing dukkha. So in facing dukkha, we start by recognizing that dukkha is simply an aspect of experience. It's an aspect of being unenlightened, is that we have this persistent background tone of discomfort, which is sometimes mild and sometimes severe, often somewhere in between. But that is it's just an aspect of reality. It doesn't define us. It doesn't control us. It's just an aspect of the universe. So we observe the experience of dukkha, observe the feeling of dukkha in the mind. And as you become more familiar with it, you'll also start to recognize that certain activities and choices of body and mind strengthen dukkha, make it stronger and more intense, while other activities of mind and body reduce dukkha, make it less intense. And through this, we can start to understand how when we fuel defilements, when we fuel desire and aversion and delusion, then we fuel dukkha. And when we cultivate the opposite, when we cultivate contentment, compassion, and wisdom, mental clarity, then dukkha diminishes. And we can start to notice that diminishing is something which can be cultivated, which is what Buddhist practice is all about. It's about cultivating practices which lead to the diminishing and cessation of dukkha. So this is another way of developing insight, which is through directly observing the experience of the Four Noble Truths, of dukkha, of how our choices and decisions can either increase or decrease dukkha, and how following the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddhist practices, leads to the diminution and cessation of dukkha. And again, this is meant to be done as a direct experience. So I'm not talking about just sitting there thinking about the Four Noble Truths, but rather it starts with cultivating a direct, full-on experience. What does dukkha feel like right now? And now, and now, and now. So constantly bringing attention to the direct experience, the feeling of dukkha, and the feeling of what produces dukkha, and the feeling of what it's like when dukkha reduces or ceases. You start to notice that there's these little moments, these little windows of peace throughout our day, where dukkha, sometimes just for a snap of the fingers, just for a moment, dukkha seems to evaporate entirely. And we realize, oh, it's possible. It's possible to have a mind which is low dukkha or even no dukkha. And then we get right back in our old habits of making ourselves miserable, and we pretty quickly forget, which is why we need to constantly bring our attention to dukkha, its causes, its cessation, and what helps it to come to an end, what helps to reduce it. And the third major category is what's called Anatta. So Anatta literally means non-self or not self. So this is recognizing that whatever we think we are is not who we are. So anything, whether physical or mental, anything that you identify as me is subject to change. Therefore, it's not you. So there's many ways of practicing not self meditation. And the way that I personally normally do is either on the tail end of the recognition of impermanence, but more commonly the way I do anatta sanya, so the recognition of not self, is through the meditation on the 6 elements. So I'll probably talk about that in the third talk on Friday. So not today, I won't. That's a fairly big topic. So maybe on Friday I'll go into more detail on the 6 elements meditation. So with each of these methods, though, what we're trying to do is to clearly perceive everything within body and mind as being not me, not mine, not belonging to me, not defining me. So one way to do this, for example, is to go through your body piece by piece. So maybe starting with your fingernails or your toes. And with each piece, asking yourself, well, is this me or is this not me? If this was removed, would that remove me? Would that destroy me? And as you go through the body, you'll see, well, there's actually nothing, no part of the body which can therefore be said to be me. And you can do the same with the mind, with any emotions or habits or thoughts or tendencies of mind. And you see, well, actually, none of those define me either. None of those are ultimately who I am. This is one way of practicing the recognition of not self. And of the 3, this is by far the most difficult. So anicca, dukkha, and anatta. Anatta is by far the most difficult because it's actually aiming directly at the root delusion, which sets enlightened beings apart from unenlightened beings. So if one clearly, truly sees anatta, then one will attain full enlightenment in that moment. So it's a very important practice to develop, but it's also a very difficult practice. So it's important to be very forgiving with oneself. And usually one is much more successful at cultivating the recognition of not self if one has already thoroughly developed the other 2. So the recognition of impermanence and the recognition of dukkha. And also it's necessary to have a thorough intellectual understanding of Buddhist doctrine. This really can't be underemphasized. Without a thorough intellectual understanding of Buddhist teachings, it is nearly impossible to attain awakening. So some people think that if they just go and sit down and meditate a lot, then they'll just figure out everything on their own. And it does sometimes work out that way. It usually takes several eons. hundreds and hundreds of lifetimes, thousands of lifetimes. But it's possible. It's possible. But there's really no need to do things the difficult way, because we have access to an incredible body of knowledge and information about the Buddha's teachings, which are universal. They're the same teachings which every Buddha gives, the same concepts which every Buddha explains. So we don't need to try to do things the hard way. Instead, we can do some study and get a clear intellectual understanding of what the Buddha taught. And then we can do some meditation and try to directly experience what he was talking about. This is the easy way. This is the straightforward way. So skipping over the study and trying to just do meditation is utterly foolish. That only works for somebody whose innate wisdom is already to the point where they're on the brink of awakening anyway, to where they're almost enlightened anyway. And you do hear stories like that sometimes of people who, from the time they're born, they already act like a monk, and then when they start getting into Buddhist practice, it's very easy for them, and they attain awakening fairly quickly. You do sometimes hear stories like that, but they're extremely rare. For the rest of us, we want to use all the tools we have at our disposal. So for cultivating experiential insight, it's important to start with intellectual understanding, an intellectual understanding of what the Buddha taught. And then we seek to directly experience it through practice. So practicing morality, practicing samadhi, which I spoke about quite a bit last week, and which I speak about quite a bit all the time, because the Buddha spoke about it a lot all the time. And then from that basis of generosity, morality, and samadhi, then one can cultivate insight. One can cultivate wisdom, this direct experiential understanding of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. So I think as the first of 3 talks on Vipassana, I think that's more than enough for now. So at this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them into the live chat, and I'll answer them as best I can. Thank you. So looking at these questions, so first off, hello to Julian, Forrest, Sharmila, Geeta, Chintapala, and Michael. Good to see you all joining in. Julian asks, when practicing Anapanasati, is it really necessary to focus on a particular place, or can I watch the breath in the all body from the nose to the abdomen? So watching in a particular place doesn't necessarily mean a very small place. You can watch the breath in a large place as long as your mind doesn't move. So, for example, if you define an area which begins at your nose and goes all the way down to your abdomen, so you have this area that's relatively large, that's fine. Just don't move your mind within that area. So your mind is steady and still in watching a large area. That's fine. Sometimes I'll meditate using my whole body as the point of focus. So you don't necessarily need to use a tiny point. You can use a large point. That's also fine. The important thing with breath meditation, once again, is not to move the mind when the breath moves. This is the temptation that people easily fall into. But rather just to watch the breath flowing in and out past the awareness. So again, like a person sitting on the shore watching the waves in the ocean. The person is not being moved around by the waves, they're just watching them. Then Phil asks, how should one deal with the 5 hindrances according to the Buddha? Well, I recommend reading the suttas if you want to see. The Buddha gives many examples. For sensual desire, one cultivates the recognition that there's no satisfaction to be found in getting sensual experiences. So recognizing the drawbacks in sensuality. For aversion, cultivating compassion and kindness, metta meditation, and recognizing the drawbacks of aversion. For dullness and drowsiness, actually the Buddha has a whole sutta where he talks about 8 methods for dealing with drowsiness. Oddly enough, it's in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of the Sevens, not in the Book of the Eights, but you can find that discourse. He gives some very practical pieces of advice, but a few things that help with drowsiness are to actively take an interest in your meditation, sit up very straight, open your eyes if your eyes are closed. Those are all quite helpful. Do walking meditation if you keep falling asleep while sitting. For agitation, the Buddha says to pay attention to peacefulness, which I find very interesting, because that gives the implication that peacefulness is always present. Even when we feel very agitated, peacefulness is there if we just pay attention to it. So that I find a very interesting answer. And for the 5th hindrance, which is skeptical doubt, the Buddha says, well, just don't pay attention to anything that produces skeptical doubt. Which again, I find a really wonderful answer. So if you're sitting there thinking like, oh, I really don't know about this or that, well, just don't think about it. That was easy. That said, the 5 hindrances are the constant recurring affliction of any Buddhist meditator. So this will be an ongoing struggle for you. And it's a huge topic. Pretty much every Buddhist teacher at some point talks about the 5 hindrances, usually over and over and over again throughout their lifetime. So I've given many talks on the subject. You can look up the talks I've given in the past or the talks that any other monk has given on the subject. There's hundreds probably on the internet that you could find. Kauser Friend says, I think anger and hatred are also a way of covering up dukkha in the short term. That's true, yeah. Says, blaming someone else for our suffering can take the edge off, but it just creates more dukkha later. Yeah, definitely true. Definitely true. Bhavani asks, how different are Samata and Vipassana meditations? How will they influence the mind differently? So, broadly speaking, you can talk about 3 kinds of meditation. There's Samata practices. Samata literally means peacefulness, by the way, from the root sam, which means peace. So Samata means peacefulness. So Samata is practices that are meant to bring peacefulness and tranquility to the mind. And that includes samadhi practices that are meant to stabilize and still the mind. But not all samatha practices are necessarily samadhi practices. So these words are not equivalent to each other. So samatha is just anything which helps to soothe and tranquilize and pacify the mind. Whereas Vipassana practices are for cultivating a direct understanding of the nature of experience. So these are quite different. Samatha practices tend to be, they tend to feel very peaceful, and they usually feel very joyful. Whereas Vipassana practices tend to be a bit more unsettling. A bit like you think you've been walking on solid ground, but suddenly the ground disappears and you're in free fall. Sometimes that's what it feels like. Sometimes it feels like being in a wave pool when you don't know how to swim. Sometimes it can feel like that. And sometimes it feels wonderful and joyful as we clearly see the causes of our dukkha and watch them melt away. But it's practicing insight meditation is not necessarily a peaceful experience, and it's not necessarily a pleasant experience. Whereas samatha meditation is almost universally pleasant and peaceful. The problem is that samatha meditation, the peacefulness and pleasantness is temporary. Whereas the peacefulness and pleasantness that comes from insight meditation is long-lasting and potentially permanent. So again, Samata meditations, Vipassana meditations, and then combine Samata Vipassana meditation, which I'll probably talk about tomorrow or the next day. So there's a few ways of practicing both in conjunction, which tend to be more on the peaceful side, while still producing insight. Then Maitreya asks, is listening to Dhamma considered a Vipassana practice? Now, once again, it depends on what you mean by Vipassana. If by Vipassana you mean cultivating an intellectual understanding of Dhamma, then the answer is yes. If by Vipassana you mean an experiential understanding, a direct experience of what the Buddha meant, then listening to a Dhamma talk is not necessarily going to produce Vipassana or be a form of Vipassana practice. It can be if while listening to the talk, you are actively trying to feel what the speaker is talking about. For example, if somebody's talking about impermanence and you start trying to feel impermanence, then you would be doing Vipassana practice. But just sitting there listening to a Dhamma talk is not necessarily Vipassana practice. But it may help you develop the intellectual foundation for Vipassana. So Forrest asks, how to embody knowledge distinct from the mundane view? I find it difficult to be consistent. Maybe if you could give some clarification. I'll start answering based on what I think you mean, but maybe if you could explain a bit better, that would help. So knowledge distinct from the mundane view. Well, mundane view I would take to mean the worldviews and attitudes of worldlings. So people who are not sincere, dedicated Buddhist practitioners. And even many people who are Buddhist practitioners, but who are not really interested in attaining awakening as quickly as possible. How to embody it? Well, the truth is that once you decide to thoroughly and completely follow the Buddha's instructions, then you will be embodying that knowledge and understanding. And it will develop in its own time, in its own way. So it may be a slow, gradual shift in your personality and your behavior, or it may be relatively quick. But allow it to happen. Don't get in the way of it. And be willing to let go of everything you currently think you are, and everything you currently like to do, and everything you currently prefer. Be willing to let all of that go. All your current identities and preferences, let it all go. Be willing to let it go. Recognizing that whatever we're holding on to, if it's not in line with the mind of a Buddha, then it has to go, no matter how much we think we like it. And as time goes by, more and more of your mind will transform and get closer to awakening. Of course, it helps a lot if you're living in a spiritual community. If you're living in a monastery, it helps a lot if you're a monk, living with other monks. It's much more difficult as a lay person. There's really no getting around this. So then Forrest clarifies. For example, the honey tip and poison root, sensual desire is too tasty. So the honey tip and poison root is actually a simile the Buddha used for aversion, though it works relatively well for sensual desire as well. And yeah, it's true. Desire and aversion are tempting. They're alluring. The Buddha said we should contemplate the gratification as well as the drawback and the escape. So not ignoring gratification, not pretending the gratification isn't there, rather being fully aware, oh yes, there is gratification in sensuality, of course. There is gratification in greed and hatred and anger and aversion, of course. If there was no gratification in these things, we would never get wrapped up in them. So recognize the gratification, but also recognize the drawbacks. And recognize the escape, which is the cultivation of disenchantment and dispassion. So in this way, there's a balanced perspective. And then you still use the things you need to use. So you need to eat to survive, for example, but you do so in the right amount in healthy ways. And anger and aversion are to be avoided entirely, of course. So Mark asks, so what is the mind if even it is impermanent? So that's not a useful question, to be perfectly honest, because it's running under the assumption that there's some kind of stable, permanent essence of mind, which can be found. So asking what is the mind? Well, there's not anything which you can call mind. So you can't give a clear label or definition to it beyond that it is impermanent. And Yasasvi is saying hello. So hello, Yasasvi. Good to see you joining in online. And Chandrasekhar asks, can contemplation and Vipassana be the same or similar? Oh, I guess contemplation could be... contemplation can be a way of developing Vipassana. But normally the word contemplation, in my mind, tends to mean more thinking about something. So that would fit in the domain of intellectual knowledge, intellectual understanding of the Dhamma, which is still good, as I've mentioned previously. In fact, it's important, it's vital, it's necessary. But Vipassana is more about experiential understanding. So you might contemplate the Four Noble Truths as a thought exercise, and then once you have some understanding of it, then try to feel what the Buddha is talking about. Try to directly experience it. But again, different teachers will use words in different ways. So some teachers will use contemplation in a way which would mean experiential understanding. So it gets a bit blurry when we leave behind Pali words and we start getting into English words. Then it gets blurry because different teachers will use these words in different ways. So that's the last of the questions. If there's no other questions, we can end for the evening. And we'll be continuing on with this topic for the next 2 evenings. So if you had more questions that didn't get answered. Oh, here's one more question. Chittapala says, I keep hearing that the Buddha never taught Vipassana. I think what they mean is that the Buddha never taught body scans. Isn't Vipassana a component of Satipatthana? Well, so body scanning is a particular way of, actually it's meant to cultivate the recognition of impermanence and to a lesser extent, the recognition of dukkha and not self. But specifically, it's for recognizing impermanence in physical sensation. So that's a perfectly valid way of practicing Vipassana meditation. So that's the Goenka method. The Goenka method is body scanning and cultivating, fundamentally, it's the perception of impermanence towards whatever appears. I could talk more about it because it's there's more to the technique than that. But yeah, body scanning is a perfectly valid way of practicing Vipassana. Again, I'm always puzzled when people say, oh, the Buddha never taught Vipassana. I'm like, has this person read the suttas? Do they know what they're talking about? Probably not. So Chandrasekhar asks, what is the Pali word for contemplation? So I have no idea. There's a lot of different words which you could translate as contemplation, and contemplation could be put as many different words. But I don't particularly like to use the word contemplation, again, except in the sense of actively thinking about something. It's the main way I use that word. Yeah, I hesitate to put it into a Pali word. I think that's just going to create confusion. So that's the end of the questions. I think we'll end at this point and resume tomorrow. So with 8 a.m. Sutta study and 7:30 meditation and another Dhamma talk on Vipassana. So for tonight, we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, see you next time.